Hi, I'm J. Christian Adams. This is the Protecting Your Vote podcast. President of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. You can find more about the Public Interest Legal Foundation at publicinterestlegal.org. We're the nation's only public interest law firm dedicated exclusively to election integrity. And with me today is a great guest, Don Palmer, the Election Assistance Commission. You are a commissioner, aren't you?
I am a commissioner, yes.
That's so cool.
Thank you.
So, Don, you and I worked at the voting section together back at the Justice Department.
We did.
And that was almost 20 years now. Holy moly.
I know.
And what I want to talk about today are two things. First of all, we'll get to Eric, because a lot of people are interested in Eric. But let's start first with cancel culture as it relates to elections, okay?
Okay.
You're a appointee on the Election Assistance Commission. I, by the way, am a presidential appointee on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And some people can't get over that, can they? And they don't want you talking to anybody, do they? I mean, as a matter of fact, what we're talking about is a recent article. Was it in Slate, I think? And it was attacking you for talking to Republican Secretaries of State. Shiver me timbers, Don. What happened there?
Well, what happened is, a Republican commissioner that was nominated by a Republican Speaker of the House, and the president nominates you and confirmed by the Senate, actually goes speak to a group of conservatives at a nonprofit about election issues. I mean, we do that all the time. That is what we do as commissioners. We not only talk to election officials and stakeholders from across the bandwidth, but we also talk to groups that have an interest in elections, like yourself and other groups.
You shouldn't be here today.
Exactly. And look, the conversation has to. You have to be able to talk to both sides of the aisle, and we do at the AAC. And so both Democrats and Republicans, they basically told me, look, Don, you are doing exactly what your job is entailing. You're having those conversations about what the EAC does, how what are the roads and bridges of what we're doing in elections to try to keep the foundation firm. And so, when they attack you, what are they really trying to do? They're really trying to impinge on the freedom of speech. They really just don't want us to talk to groups that might be conservative in nature. They don't want us to speak to Republican Secretaries of State. They don't want us to have those lines of communication. And that really is impinging on, freedom of speech and freedom of association.
And Don, your background, just so the folks listening know, before you were commissioner on the AC, you were essentially the statewide elections director in two of the largest states in the country, weren't you?
I was the chief election official in Virginia. And then, yes, I was a state director in Florida. So I've been doing this for a while since the voting section. It's actually a little bit more fun because you're actually helping people vote. You're helping secure the systems. You get to talk to all types of citizens. And and then when there's a recount, that's when things get really crazy.
Right. Now, going back to this piece in Slate, it's written by Richard Hazen, who is one of the original cancel culture champions and a big foe of free speech going back to the campaign finance days, and somebody named Dahlia Lithwick. And her problem and Hazen's problem was that you actually have a dialogue with people with whom Hazen disagrees. That's the problem here. Now, talk a little bit about whether or not other election assistance commissioners, other secretaries of state communicate with left of center organizations. It's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, isn't it?
Well, of course they do. And often the Republican commissioners aren't often invited to those. So occasionally there'll be meetings where we meet with both Democratic and Republican commissioner or secretaries of state or election officials. But yeah, I'm not invited to their parties very often. And frankly, we should be doing more of that. If we actually had conversations and not just attacking each other in the media, we actually might be making some progress on what those areas of agreement can be. And just for the record, Christian, I talk with and work with my Democratic colleagues every day. And so we have to find a path forward for basic election administration. And so to be attacked for, talking to Republicans or conservative groups or, public interest groups, that is just,
un-American. I'll say it. I'll say it.
It's just hypocritical.
Right.
Christian.
So let's compare this. In early 2000, one election official who was very critical of you, namely Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, she engaged in outreach, direct conferences with left-wing organizations, with Vanita Gupta of the Leadership Committee, and other organizations attempting to spool up Zuckerberg money. This was a meeting with Jocelyn Benson, and she was right there at the beginning of Zuckbucks. And so did she ever come clean on that, to your knowledge? Did she ever reveal her public role in those meetings? I never saw them. Maybe you did.
I don't know anything about that.
Of course not.
No, but my only point is I'm not administering elections. And I understand that, yes, absolutely, we need free and fair elections that without a perception that there's influence one way or the other. That's why I talk to everybody.
Right.
On the other hand, I mean, when you are actually an administrator, a chief election official, you're much more sensitive to that because you are the person in charge of administering elections. And so here I am. I did administer elections at the state level multiple times and recounts, but I'm no longer doing that. We're overseeing a process at the EAC. As a chief election official, that's actually where you need to be a little bit more careful because and talking to groups across the aisle. But I haven't been invited to anything in Michigan.
Let's talk about not invited. I think one of the chief, the godfathers of this cancel culture is this Richard Hazen, a law professor. You all can Google him, look him up. He moves around a lot, so I can never tell what law school he's teaching at a moment. But he, a long time ago, has this election blog. And over the years, you've watched people like Hans von Stokowski will write law review articles, and Hazen just doesn't pay any attention. He doesn't. It's almost like this sort of. Well, actually, it's sort of like what Twitter and Google did for a while, isn't it? Where they hide opposing viewpoints. Public Interest Legal Foundation would win lawsuits after lawsuits after lawsuits on cutting edge stuff. Just ignores it because it doesn't exist. They have conferences, right, where Hazen and Justin Levitt, who you know who that is, and all of these other left of center academics, although I repeat myself, they have these conferences and they don't invite the leading people on the right who are making all the law in this area to come speak. Now, they always have their flunkies, right? They have like Matt Masterson show up. Oh, we're bipartisan, or Ben Ginsburg, right? That ship has sailed. That's not a bipartisan event. But they do that to have a bipartisan trapping so they can tell people it's bipartisan. But it's all a big scam, it seems. It's a cancel culture on the left when it comes to election law. And if you talk to anybody as Secretary of State, by golly, they're going to go attack. It's unbelievable.
Well, it really does. I mean, look, there's exclusion. And one of the things we do at the EAC is we try not to exclude anybody. We'll have a very balanced panel for our discussions. We'll have both left and right, Democrat, Republican. But you don't get that with groups, even like Rick Hazen. And my problem with Rick Hazen, is often, I go back, and maybe it's 20, 30 years from now. I never really had this conversation with him. But he wrote a book called Voting Wars. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. It's like around 05-ish.
Well, it was very prophetic. I mean, there have been a lot of voting wars.
He was almost asking for him, wasn't he?
Well, I think when you talk about lawfare and elections, it really causes sort of the extremes to come up, right? And it basically creates what we have now, cancel culture, very polarized view of election administration. Since we've been into this voting wars era, and I don't want to place all the blame, obviously, on Rick Hazen, but, it actually was prophetic because what we have is had decades of litigation in this that have just been really detrimental to the election administration community. And when you look at it, most of these folks in election administration, in fact, 99% of them, are just bureaucrats doing their job based on laws that are passed by legislators. And yet the legal system and lawfare and sort of the voting war concept is let's go after the election administrator. Let's go after the election laws, which most don't have an impact on voting. Election administrators, if it comes to ID or certain policies, they can conform, and voters are able to adapt, and they vote successfully. But if we make every issue, very dramatic and partisan, and there's a lot of flame throwing going on, that doesn't bring people together. It really creates voting wars.
Right. Recently, you testified along with Hans von Spakovsky to the House Administration Committee. I'm sure Hazen was squirming when Hans was testifying. But these folks on the left who engage in the cancel culture, like the folks we've talked about, they need to understand people like Hans are listened to by everybody right of center. And, when you have a conference, maybe you want to hear those perspectives. Instead, the approach toward Hans has been awful. It's been shunning. They've attempted to just shun him like he's a non-entity. And What a stupid, dumb mistake that is.
Well, in some ways, Hans is, he understands the issues very well, and he's articulate, and he has been shunned. But I think, it actually is everybody right of center.
Right.
Everybody center right.
Except Ben Ginsberg and Matt Masterson. They always get invited.
There's very few that are even able to have a conversation with them. And I frankly think I could have a conversation with them, but they just simply do not want to have that conversation. The thing about the Election Assistance Commission is that we all come from different paths, and Democrat, Republican, and some worked on the Hill, some have worked in elections. We've all been involved in election administration, but we actually have to work together. We actually have to talk to each other about the way forward on fundamental issues about voting and election administration. And so it is possible. And Kristen McCormick and I are conservatives. We're principled. We understand election law. We worked in the voting section. We understand the voting laws. We understand the civil rights. And we understand that there is a way forward that we can work with our colleagues. Yet, it seems that it's just impossible for some to work with anybody that might have a Republican label or be conservative in the way they view or have any sense of election integrity. It's remarkable that can occur outside of when you have to.
I'm struck. You reminded me, Don, when we were both at the voting section, all of the lawyers, we all got along. Eve left or right. I mean, there were some pretty hardcore left-wing lawyers in that voting section, but we all talked. We all worked together on cases. It can happen, but it doesn't seem to happen anymore in this area.
Well, I think when you actually have to work together, and I bring up the AC, we actually have to work together. And in the voting section, we had to work together. And I think that when you work on a case, then there may be some distrust in the beginning, but you can get over that by showing that you understand the law, the facts, how to apply it to a case. And when we were in the voting section, I think there was a record number of cases.
Yeah,
because we understood.
We could do a whole show on that, couldn't we?
It's like, look, I mean, we're here to follow the law. What does the law say? What are the facts we see? And there needs to be justice in this case. Yeah. And you bring a case. And I think that there actually was some respect gained and we were able to work together because once you go through that process, it's like, well, oh my gosh, Christian Adams, he actually, knows how to build a case, bring it, and maybe perhaps get a consent decree to bring justice in a case that demanded or to follow the law. And I felt that I did the same thing when I was at the Civil Rights Division.
You did. Let's shift the topic to Eric, because I think you and I have seen Eric as an opportunity to give a fair, balanced ledger, the good and the bad, sometimes the ugly. It depends on who's doing what. And so Eric is the Electronic Registration Information Center. And do you share my views that it's good for a state to participate so the cross-checking data is available heading into an election, meaning people who are registered in more than one state?
I do. I absolutely do. And that's why I was a proponent and was one of the original founders of states of Eric.
Which state?
I was in Virginia, so we were a founding member. But I have to laugh. We had a legislator. We were at the Board of Advisors meeting. We had a legislator from Kentucky, and he made a good joke. He said, "Who's this Eric guy that I keep hearing about in the legislature?" And it was pretty funny because it was like he had no idea, but he actually did. He was just a joke, tongue in cheek. But look, this is really no way to identify folks that are registered or voting in another state or in two states. And a state needs to have that information. And so there are other ways that we might be able to update the accuracy of our voter rolls. But that is one area where you just cannot get the data, to properly remove someone or to investigate potential double voting. And so this was really the genesis of Eric, and it's why it spread to about 30 states before, or 30 plus states before we start having these issues.
Right. But obviously Eric has problems. There's a perception of unfairness in the governance. So you aren't just here to shill for Eric. You recognize that there's areas for improvement, I take it.
Well, look, I mean, Eric is made up of member states that are of state directors and their secretaries of state. And as with any organization that involves elections and election administration, like the EAC, you have to try. It's going to have to be a bipartisan group that works together to find the path forward. When they simply cannot find, consensus and partisan, when members or the executive board are dealing with outside groups that have nothing to do with election administration, but are too close to the sun, as I like to say, to the partisan areas.
Yeah,
like
right.
well, the relationship with CEIR and others, right?
CEIR.
I think it was
What's
like
it stand for? Center for Election Innovation and Research, otherwise known as David Becker.
Well, I mean, look, and so look, when that becomes public, then it becomes a discussion not about the good work that Eric does. It becomes a discussion of how was that able to happen? Is it a partisan actor? And then all the secretaries and directors that are part of this are on defense, trying to defend the actions that should never have taken place in the first place. And this is my view. And again, I've been in out of Eric for a number of years because I went to work at the Bipartisan Policy Center and I went to go work at the EAC where I am today. So I'm not involved in the day-to-day conversations. But when secretaries of state have to defend the actions of the executive board or Eric with other entities, that becomes a problem and not one that they can stand up to. And look, they shouldn't have to defend the actions of Eric. Eric should be doing its core mission, which is share data between the states and identify folks who are registered or voting in other states. And there is a registration part of that, where you offer the opportunity to registration. There wasn't a problem until there was these allegations of activities outside the core duties of Eric.
So what is your prediction on what happens next, if you have one, about I kind of think the exodus is capped, that it's hit the maximum and it's going to go forward with the states that are in it?
I think, unfortunately, there'll be more exits because I think most of the secretaries of state want to have an organization that is non-political and is not engaged. What they see is non-political, or the perception of. Now it's into the state legislatures and party folks who believe that there's partisanship in the organization. There are a significant number of states left. It's unfortunate, and more may be coming. Now it may be capped at some point, but when states are already looking for an alternative, they're going to proceed with that because they realize, even though they've left Eric, they realize they need an alternative,
which they don't have right now. By the way, let's just be
clear. There's no alternative, and I say, look, there is no alternative, and look, you create a system, you should join both. You should be involved with both.
That's interesting.
I always say
there were double cross-check Eric states, weren't there? I think Virginia was one.
Of course there were.
Yeah.
That's why I say there.
Yeah.
In fact, you should be doing a lot of your own analysis. I believe that states can have data centers and where they compare lists with neighboring regional or nationwide states. We did that in Virginia. We did our own thing because when we first started, not every state was a member of ERIC. Not every state was a member of Crosscheck. And so there were states, particularly bordering states, that we wanted to compare lists. Mm-hmm. So as a chief election official, you have to be agnostic a little bit on personalities and that. And that was why I joined ERIC. I called it list maintenance on steroids.
Yeah, it is.
The data was very good. List maintenance on steroids. But again, I come to the point that I had to go and convince my legislature and my governor it was a good idea. They put their trust in me. And Eric has to realize that when that trust is broken in any way, real or perceived, that it's got to be fixed. It's got to be fixed. Otherwise, people are going to do other options that are more politically palpable.
I agree. All right. Well, listen, Don Palmer, Commissioner of the Election Assistance Commission, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you. I'm glad you testified to Congress. They need to hear from you. I'm Jay Christian Adams. You've been watching Protecting Your Vote podcast. At the Public Interest Legal Foundation, we have lots more information about this. You can go online, publicinterestlegal.org. You can follow us at PILF Foundation on Twitter. And you can help and learn and really get involved in what's happening in elections. Till next time, I'm Jay Christian Adams. This has been Protecting Your Vote.